back to the Bat, Fox, and Flux Tavern. This is episode 5. Today we will be discussing races. Yes, not classes, finally, something different. There are several races in the core book, and we're going to start with human. Human's the baseline. Humans are pretty much whatever they want to be in D&D. The only real restrictions are if the setting you're in, for whatever reason, decides that humans follow some sort of narrow, predictable set of behaviors or appearance, then certainly that's something you're going to want to ask your DM about. But generally speaking, and I've never run into that myself, except maybe once or twice, and that was just because you wanted to start in a very specific way. Humans can be whatever you want them to be. They can have any color skin, any sort of accent, any sort of look to them that's seen in the human race as it exists today, or as any time in the last several hundred years of humanity. They really don't get a lot of spectacular bonuses like some of the other races. They get bonuses to stats, they get special abilities. But what the humans do get is versatility. The variety of humans is reflected in the very nature of humans in D&D, and that humans in D&D are the well-rounded race. They don't really have any negatives, they don't really have any super positives. They just have great versatility. Now, this versatility does end up being a super positive in 3.5. I don't feel like it was intentionally meant to be, so I think it was intentionally meant to be like the baseline, boring, well, this is just if you're human, this is nothing special, but hey, if you be this other thing, you get this. But it ends up becoming a very important strength to what humans are. And Flux last week wanted to talk a bit on that, but for the sake of time, I'm going to just rush through the racial traits of humans here a bit. Humans get an extra skill point at every level, 4 extra skill points at first level. What that equates into in a practical sense is humans essentially have one more skill if you follow the standard always max your skills at first level procedure. As we explained back in classes, that's really the way to go with pretty much any class, is always max your skills that you pick.
We'll get into more detail about that later.
Yeah, we'll be doing a week on skills and feats coming up, where we'll get into more details on that. But what that essentially means is that if you're a rogue, you're that much more roguish in a way, because you get to have that one extra skill that other rogues that aren't human don't have, even if they have the same intelligence you do. If you're a class with very few skills, that means that you have an extra skill, which kind of offsets the fact that your class has very few skills. Another good thing about them is they get an extra feat at first level, which means at first level, humans, generally speaking, have at least one more feat than everyone else in the party, unless everyone in the party happens to be human, in which case you're all more or less pretty even, not excluding bonus feats from certain classes at level 1. And they also get an automatic language of common, because that's really all humans speak is common, but they're bonus languages. If you have a high enough intelligence, you get bonus languages based on your intelligence modifier when you create your character. Humans get any bonus language. Any language that is a listed language in D&D. There's a whole table of it in the skill section under the skills associated with reading and speaking languages. They can learn. You can start off the bat with a human who knows how to speak the tongue of demons if you really, really want to.
There is only a few languages you cannot learn,
Which
through
are
your bonus
secret
language.
languages, yes. The secret language list, which is mostly druidic and any secret languages your DM may have come up with for your setting.
Or Drow Sign language.
Drow Sign language, yeah. But that's not in the base list of secret languages anyway. Humans, they run the gambit. They can become an adventure for any reason. They can come from any place pretty much, unless the DM specifically mentions certain places humans don't live there. Even then, you can check your DM and see if it can be just like one of a few or a lone human who happens to come from an area that isn't associated with humans. I've tried to do that in the past. It can be very fun for roleplay reasons. I had a character who was essentially a hermit who just came down one day and was just like, hey, what's up going on in the world? And kind of got caught up in the events of the campaign. Humans can really worship any god. They tend to worship Pale or the sun god, mostly because if you're on good terms with the sun god, you're going to have food. Sun helps the food grow. But they can worship anything. They can even worship deities of other races if they really want to. You know, the deity isn't going to complain about it, and if the human wants to, he can, because that's just how humans are. That's really all there is to say about human. You know, you yourself are a human. I'm a human. Red Fox is a human. Flux might be human. The jury's still out on that.
I'll
But
never tell.
exactly. So really, there's not much to say about humans in D&D other than their mechanics as a race, which, as I said, is the extra skill point and the extra feat to represent human variety, versatility, and diversity. So getting into our first true race, and by true race I mean something that isn't a human, are dwarves.
Dwarves are traditional fantasy dwarves. Small little people, really gruff, really kind of tough. So dwarves automatically get a +2 constitution because they're strong. And they get -2 charisma because they're also kind of gruff and strong. So people don't really like the gruff and strongness of dwarves unless you're a dwarf. Even though it seems like they shouldn't be, dwarves are considered medium. So it means dwarfs have no special bonuses or disabilities for being large or small. They just get a baseline. There's no changes. Now, first change from humans, or from most base creatures. Dwarfs' land speed is 20. That's how much you can move in a turn. That's also the movement, how much most small races can move. To compensate for that, dwarves will not get movement penalties because they're wearing heavy armor, or because they have a very large load. So if you have a dwarf, there's no reason not to load him up with a crap ton of armor and a crap ton of equipment.
He gets to be the mule.
The only penalties for doing that is you suffer dex bonuses, and you're not really going to be making an agile dwarf, most likely.
Yeah.
Dwarfs also get dark vision. They're one of the 2 base races that can get that. They can see in the dark up to 60 feet. It's black and white only, but otherwise like normal light, and they can function fine without any light at all. Now, big thing here. Dark vision is not low light vision. Just because you have dark vision, I don't believe you also get low light vision.
Absolutely correct.
Dwarves are equally as bad in low light as humans are, even though they can see in the dark.
Yep.
Dwarves also get stone cutting. Dwarves automatically get a +2 bonus to search checks if they need to notice unusual stonework or new constructions and pretty much anything that's made of stone or architecture. A dwarf who merely comes within 10 feet of unusual stonework can make a search check as if he was actively searching. Dwarf can use the search skill to find stonework traps as a rogue can. So if you're in like an underground dungeon, a rogue can off trap check just because of his abilities. They can also intuit depth. So the same way a human can usually know which way's up, even though that's a very stupid thing for the book to say considering pilots, a dwarf can tell how deep in the ground they are. This seems minute, and it usually is, but in some special cases, you can actually get some pretty decent role-playing knowledge out of knowing how deep in the ground you are.
Oh, yeah. Also, it helps especially if your campaign prominently features the Underdark, so you know when to stop going down. Because even if you're high enough level to go down there, don't go in the Underdark. Just don't.
It's a bad idea.
There's nothing there for you but pain, misery, the off chance of loot, and that off chance of loot does not offset the pain and misery of the Underdark.
Dwarfs have a really called weapon familiarity. They can treat dwarven war axes and dwarven urgoshes as martial equipment rather than exotic. So getting martial proficiency automatically lets you use those 2 exotic weapons without having to get feats.
They're essentially specialized weapons that dwarves themselves have made.
It's kind of minor depending on your character, but it's a nice little thing. Dwarfs get stability. Dwarves are exceptionally stable on their feet. You gain a +4 bonus on ability checks made to resist bull rushes or getting tripped while you're standing on the ground, not when you're flying, climbing, or anything else. This is minor depending on how good your DM is with using all the other abilities in combat, but another good thing about it is it sets a precedent for dwarfs. If you can establish that your dwarf is stable, you can also establish that he's probably not going to get blown down by heavy gusts of wind if you're fighting an elemental. You can establish that he's probably not going to get knocked over during an earthquake or something. So if you talk with your DM about it, this can establish a precedent for other things that a dwarf could do.
Which is something to always bear in mind. Just because the rules do or don't state certain things in relation to an ability doesn't mean your DM can't, if persuaded, rule that it does work in ways not explicitly stated. Case in point was we were going over Paladin, and Flux brought up the absurdity that is Grapple Horse, which exists solely because the book says that horses can grapple, but it doesn't say they can't initiate. Similar thing, less absurd. The book doesn't really go into too much detail on how this ability works, so with a discussion with your DM, you could make the argument that it can work in other situations other than what the book says it does.
Dwarfs also gain a +2 racial bonus on saving throws against poison. That's pretty nice. If you're fighting a rogue or a spider or anything, you're not going to get poisoned that much because +2 is pretty big, I think. I think most classes get about, at max, 1 per level. So.
Oh yeah, and a +1 to anything in D&D in 3.5 is actually generally the baseline. It's very rare to get anything bigger than a +1 as a buff or a -1 as a debuff. If you get things that are 2 or more, you're in the realm of a very powerful ability at that point. It doesn't sound that powerful, and to be honest, at higher levels it isn't. 3.5 did not scale well, but early game, you're pretty much never going to get poisoned because of that +2.
That's an extra 5% on a dice roll to succeed, which
Yeah.
is pretty decent. Dwarves also get a +2 racial bonus to save against spells and spell-like effects. Again, really nice. You're not going to get charmed that easily as a dwarf.
Which gets useful when you're fighting spellcasters.
Dwarves get a +1 racial bonus to attack rolls against orcs, including half-orcs, we'll get to that, and goblinoids, including goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears, because they're pretty much trained to fight the things they're going to encounter in their homes. That's something that's common to most races. Pretty much every race has a racial bonus attack rolls against something.
Yeah, for the most part.
Dwarves get a +4 dodge bonus against giants. Depending on your DM, that might never be seen, or it might be seen a lot. If it's seen a lot, that's a really big bonus. That is a gigantic bonus.
That's also a very dickish DM.
Yeah. It's essentially like getting a whole nother piece of armor. I believe leather armor is about 4 AC.
Granted,
So you get an additional 4.
Granted, that sounds like a lot until you look at the stat table of a giant and you realize that this is not something you want to fuck with, even with the racial bonuses against them that dwarves get. And as we get into later, halflings, I believe, also get bonuses against dwarves because it's established that for whatever reason, halflings and giants, for whatever reason, get into massive David and Goliath fight.
Yeah. Dwarves also get a +2 racial bonus on appraise checks relating to stone or metal. And so you can kind of intuit how much money you can get from a metal or stonecraft item. Again, that might come into play a lot or might come in not that much. They also, as you can expect with the appraise check, they get a +2 racial bonus on craft checks with stone and metal because they're dwarves. Dwarves' automatic languages are common and dwarven. Their bonus languages are giant, gnome, goblin, orc, Terran, and undercommon. I will advise Terran and undercommon aren't going to be used that much. Giant is the language of giants, which is self-explanatory. Gnome as well. Goblin, orc. Terran is the language of earth elemental, which is nice to have because it's nice to be able to talk to an elemental.
In general is good.
Yeah, mainly you would want that orc language.
Oh yeah,
because orcs are big enemies in D&D.
Orc and Goblin are the two languages that I recommend. If you cannot learn any other language, learn one of those. Because those two enemies are going to be the ones that you're coming into contact with the absolute most. And it's going to be incredibly useful to the party if everyone or most of the party understands this. So there's very little having to stop and have the party take a moment to explain shit to the one guy who can't hear what's going on when you're interrogating a prisoner.
Gnome isn't that bad, but you're probably not going to be fighting that many gnomes, or if you are, you probably have a gnome in your party. And giant, they're giants. You're not really going to talk them out of things.
No. Unless your DM's nice, it makes the giants able to reason with you. Generally speaking, if you're fighting a giant, they're beyond reason. Because there's two types of giants I find in D&D. There's the typical brutish giant who just isn't going to listen to you because he just wants to crush you and grind you into bread. And then there's the super intelligent giants, compared to the typical giant, I guess you could say they are. They're giants who have their own society, and their concerns are purely for giants, and they care nothing for you little folk. If you're talking to them, it's either going to be on peaceful grounds or not at all. If you're in a fight, don't worry about it.
And the fact is, if it's an intelligent giant, your DM's probably going to give them another language. They might know common. If it's not, you're also a dwarf who have a history of fighting giants. So you're not going to start out on peaceful contact usually.
Unless you find a very open-minded giant, there is going to be some tension there off the bat that could very quickly mount into either your party member or the giant just throwing a blow because racial hatreds, which is a thing D&D deals with.
Dwarves' favorite class is fighter. So if a dwarf has a fighter, they can multi-class into another class and not have an XP penalty as long as they keep fighter and something else. If you get 3 multi-classes, you're taking the XP penalty.
Yes, which is actually something I think we left out of humans, is that humans have favorite classes of any, which means that humans can just set whatever class they are as their favorite class, allowing humans to always multi-class no matter what.
Well, humans, whatever class has the highest level is automatically default their favorite class.
Yeah, that's something we kind of forgot to talk about last week at the end, was multi-classing and XP penalties. You actually do get a penalty for multi-classing, and if it's not in your favorite class, it's a pretty sizable penalty.
I had intended to save that for one of our final episodes. We'll actually be running you down through character creation from fluff to mechanics. And I was going to cover multi-classing there, because really in character creation is when you want to start looking at your multi-classing. Because if you're going to multi-class, generally speaking, the requirements for it require that you plan it out ahead of time. You plan your race and your class in conjunction usually to better maximize your chances of getting to your multi-class class at the earliest possible level.
Yeah, otherwise you're going to be taking a 20% penalty to your XP.
If your campaign uses XP, which most do. Sometimes you get a nice DM who just says, fuck it, you level up when the plot demands it.
Dwarves are usually lawful, and they also tend towards good. If they're an adventuring type, they're less likely to fit the common mold, and sometimes you'll see some other ones, but generally speaking, lawful good's mainly what they're going to be. Their chief deity is Morden. He's the creator of the dwarves, and expects his followers to work for the betterment of the dwarven race. They get along fine with gnomes, passably with humans and half-elves and halflings, and they don't understand the ways of the elf at all because the elves are just too different to the dwarves' way of doing things. Dwarves mistrust half-orcs in general because, well, their hatred for orcs. Dwarves are fair-minded most of the time. They grant all half-orcs the opportunity to prove themselves, but there is always that opening distrust of half-orcs.
The main idea for a dwarf in base D&D is you are not a singular entity. Everything a dwarf does is for his clan and for the betterment of dwarves. You going out for adventure is to bring back renown to your clan, usually, or to bring back goods to your clan or help your clan. Dwarves going out just for greed or solo want for renown do happen, but it's not the typical dwarf.
Which is why the typical dwarf is lawful good.
Yes.
They have the dwarf code they live by, the dwarf law they live by, and they are generally a good person who's going for the betterment of their family and their society.
In fact, this is even reflected in dwarf names. Very interesting plot point to work with is that a dwarf's name is not the dwarf's. It is not your name. It is a name given to you by the clan that has been used by someone who, in history, did something good or made enough mark on the world that the dwarf clan took their name. It is not your name, and it can be taken from you if need be. So if you're doing a dwarf who's stripped of honor, you're probably not going to have a dwarven name, because no dwarf will call you by that name because it's not yours anymore.
Now, that said, that's usually your clan name. Dwarves usually have two names like a human would. One is the clan name, which, as Flux said, is something that the clan gives you. And then one is just the given name, the thing that identifies you as an individual. A dwarf who doesn't have a clan name probably did something to fuck up, and his clan got pissed at him and revoked the clan from his name.
And again, as you can tell from all the speaker clans are big to dwarves. Yes. If you're not of a clan, you're essentially a non-factor in dwarven society. You're considered pretty much automatically a rogue or thief, or someone who by definition has automatically fucked up enough that one clan does not want to deal with you, so know that the clan is going to give you the time of the day.
A good modern analogy to it is if anyone listening has played Dragon Age, a dwarf without a clan name is essentially the caste list in Dragon Age. The not having a clan name has essentially branded them as someone undesirable in dwarven society, whether or not they did what they were accused of doing. The clan has just chosen to take that away, and that is just a mark on them that they have to live with for the rest of their life.
But unlike Dragon Age, a clanless dwarf who has a child, the child is not beholden to the sins of the father.
Also, it is possible to reclaim your clan name if you do something sufficiently dwarvy enough. It's kind of a weird word.
One big thing to note is dwarves are not greedy in D&D.
No, they're not.
It's a big, easy thing to see dwarves and like, oh, the traditional thought of dwarves, they're greedy, they keep all the gold. No, actually, dwarves just keep all dwarven resources to themselves because they notice they're non-replenishable. Gold is dwarven gold. Every single bit of gold that goes out of Dwarven Kingdom is gold that's probably not going to come back. So dwarves usually barter a lot because they don't want to get rid of things that are essentially theirs and part of their history.
Right, and the old things that you tend to see dwarves with jewelry, that's more to reflect the craftsmanship of their clan's craftsmen, because generally a dwarf will wear things made by their own clan's craftsmen, and he wants to show off to the other clans, hey, this is the shit my clan makes. Which is why you tend to have that typical image of a dwarf with earrings or gilded beard holders and things like that when they braid their beards and hold them in place. That's usually a reflection of the fact they're proud of their clan, and they want to show off the goods made by their clan, because that's basically the dwarven equivalent of advertisement. Elves are very much bullshit. There's a reason I like to play elves. If you're any kind of a spellcasting class, or any kind of a class that relies on dexterity, then, my god, play an elf. For the love of all that is broken and cheap in the world, play an elf. Elves, to do a bit of generalized fluff on elves are very long-lived. Not as long-lived as some other media where elves are either immortal or live for thousands of years. What is the actual max age of an elf in 3.5? I always get the additions confused.
I think it's like 500, 300 is middle age.
Maximum age for a elf is 350 plus 4 D percentile years. So you're looking at 750 years maximum.
So yeah, you'll be a few centuries shy of a full millennium of life if you live the full allotted span that an elf could potentially live without magic interfering and making them live longer. They're usually very slim, very lithe. Interesting note, in D&D, elves are not tall. The tallest an elf generally gets is actually 5.5 feet tall in 3.5. They're usually between 4.5 to 5.5 feet. Elves are actually rather short compared to a human, but they're also very spindly. And so they almost seem taller than they are, probably because of their physical build. But they generally look very frail and weak, but they're not really frail and weak. They're very dexterous and they're very intelligent, and their intelligence and their dexterity allows them to offset their natural flimsiness with smart movements and quick movements. Most elves live in woodlands. They usually live in no more than a few hundred strong communities. You're pretty much considered a child as an elf until 50 to 60 years old.
You get a name at 100, so about there.
Yeah, about 100 years old is when you're officially considered an adult by elves. And yet, I believe elves normally age roughly the same as a human until a certain point, and then it just grinds to a halt for a while. Which means you're physically in your 20s, but technically still a child by elf standards because of how long elves live. I believe during that 100 years, all elves really do is hang around and learn shit. That's pretty much what elves do until they're around 110. You just go around learning shit. You learn how to fight if you want to fight. You learn how to draw if you want to draw, which is why elves do well in classes that can learn a lot of skills, because fluff-wise, that makes sense. Certainly there are elf fighters and everything else. They're rare, but they exist. Elves tend to be spellcasters, rogues, and things like that, where their knowledge and their years of experience before they're considered an adult and go out into the world can definitely be reflected in the dedication or the sheer skillfulness of their chosen class. Not to say that you can't do something else and just be particularly dense and unskilled. Or you can look at another way and have an elf that has few skills and think of it as an elf who's just very specialized. Some elves are very specialized. They pick one thing to learn and they learn all that they can about it to become good at that one thing. Which is why elf fighters can be terrifying. Because in Fluff, what an elf fighter essentially is someone who spent the last 100 years or so learning nothing but how to stab you in the face with a sword really well. You've spent a century mastering your chosen weapon, mastering your fighting, and becoming the best, most graceful fighter you can be, because elves pride themselves on grace in all things they do, including combat.
Elves are very lithe and able to move quickly, so elves gain +2 dexterity. They're also very skinny. So any hits they're taking are big hits, so they get a -2 to Constitution, which kind of balances out. It means an elf gets an extra 1 to AC, but gets a -1 to health for each level. Elves are medium, again baseline, and they have a baseline speed of 30. Now we get into the bullshit. Elves are immune to magical sleep effects. They don't get a bonus to it, they are just outright immune. Elves also gain a +2 racial saving throw against enchantment spells or effects. Can't charm an elf that well. Elves gain low light vision. They can see twice as far as a human in starlight, moonlight, torchlight, or other low illumination. They do not gain dark vision. These are two completely separate things. They also retain the ability to distinguish color and detail under low light vision. How useful that is depends on your DM, but low light vision is usually rather nice. It means elf can take essentially like a first shift during the night. Now we come to the bullshit. Elves receive a free martial weapon proficiency for longswords, rapiers, longbows, composite longbows, short bows, and composite short bows. You note, this is not like dwarves, where dwarves still have to take a feat to get access to their familiarity. No, elves automatically get feats to use 6 different types of weaponry that they just can automatically use without having to spend a whole feat on.
Because elves live 100 years and they spend that 100 years learning how to fight with the favorite weapons of their god, which is swords and bows.
That's not the answer, Sovek. The answer is because they're bullshit.
Well, I was going to extend that to being because their god is bullshit, but okay, if you want to just say the elves themselves are bullshit.
So, that means an elf wizard can automatically know how to use swords, which is a nice thing to know for a wizard.
Incredibly useful, as I stated back during Wizards.
Elves gain a +2 racial bonus on Listen, Search, and Spot, so a total of +6 skills, An elf who merely passes within 5 feet of a secret or concealed door can automatically make a search check to see if he was looking for it. And elves gain automatic languages Common and Elven. Bonus languages Draconic, that's the language of kobolds, dragons.
It's also
and
the language of a lot of ancient magical tomes, because dragons were the progenitors of magic in the world in most lores in the D&D settings.
They learn Gnoll, they can learn Gnome, Goblin, Orc, and Sylvan, which is the language of air elementals. The favorite class of elf is Wizard, which means as long as they have Wizard, they multi-class into one other class. You may have noticed they don't seem to have that many racial traits compared to dwarves. But as stated, that free weapon proficiency is utter bullcrap.
It is.
It is incredibly bullshit. Elves get probably one of the fewest racial traits outside of humans who really don't have racial traits, but elves, being one of those few people that get only a handful of traits, somehow become more bullshit because of it. Because if they had any more traits, then we would just rebel and play nothing but elves unless they change the rules somehow.
Now you might think, 6 weapons, that's not that big. You only really need 1 weapon and 1 ranged weapon. So an elf automatically gets, essentially, a free feat, like a human does, and a bunch of other bonus immune to sleep, low light vision, and plus 6 skill and ability to sense dwarves.
They are essentially giving you the cream of the crop of martial weapons, in the sense that those are the weapons you use when you're not really built as a class to use martial weapons. If you're a wizard and you have access to those, that means you have a reliable, effective, powerful melee weapon and ranged weapon at your disposal that other wizards would not get access to. A wizard with a bow is amazing, because normally the wizard's only choice for a ranged weapon is either a sling or a really shitty small crossbow. Having a sword is even better if they get in your face. It gives rogues access to bigger, better weapons than they would normally get, because I don't think rogues get long swords. A sorcerer having access to those is incredibly powerful, because sorcerer is already built to be slightly less squishy than a wizard anyway. So giving him access to a powerful and effective melee weapon, like a longsword or a rapier, just makes him that much better at being the not squishy wizard. And that's why those feats are just so powerful, despite their seeming innocence. There's also the fact that elves just don't sleep.
Completely immune.
Yeah. In fact, normally, everyone else requires 8 hours of sleep to get the effects of a full rest. An elf requires 4 hours of trance, which is their equivalent of sleep, where they just go into this weird dreamlike trance state.
Elves love freedom, variety, and self-expression, and because of that, they lean strongly towards the gentler aspects of chaos. Generally, they value and protect others' freedoms as well as their own, and they are more often good than not. So most elves you'll find that are in elf society will be chaotic good. There are some exceptions with adventurers, of course, but for the most part, chaotic good is the standard for an elf. So you can kind of see why elves and dwarves don't get along right off the bat. Their alignments are opposite on the chaos and laws side. That creates conflict on anything. They consider humans to be rather unrefined, halflings a bit staid, gnomes trivial, and dwarves not fun at all. They look on half-elves with some degree of pity, as they regard them as lesser beings. Mixed with human blood, their elven features have been diminished. They're not very particular the way halflings and dwarves can be. They're generally pleasant to them, though. They regard half-orcs, however, with unrelenting suspicion, unlike the dwarves, who will give a unique person the chance to prove themselves to be decent. The elves don't give a shit.
And that's generally because of their long lifespan. It gives them more of a long-term thinking, where generally speaking, friends they meet will not live even a fraction of the time they live. So they tend to judge entire families or entire communities, if not entire races, on a very generalized scale.
However, they are generally pleasant and gracious, even to those who fall short of elven standards. And
that actually brings up the good point that if you do reach elven standards, congratulations.
Which is nearly impossible.
You've made your family a friend for the next 5 generations.
Yeah, elven standards, pretty much anyone who's not an elf will never reach those standards.
Pretty much. Elf standard is elves. They try not to make it seem so black and white, but the elf standard for everything is another elf. Yeah. Do you act elf-like? Are you everything an elf should be? They don't think about it that way in their head, but that's how it translates, whether intentional or not. And that's just sort of a curse of being an elf, is that you're perpetually comparing other things to elves. Because you have no other sense of context. You're so long-lived compared to other races. Even to dwarves. Dwarves live a long time, too. But where a dwarf may live possibly 2 lifetimes of a man, an elf is going to live 5 lifetimes of a man, maybe more. Which is why if someone befriends an elf and that elf swears to look after that family, that's a promise that's going to span more than just 1 or 2 generations.
Oh, yeah.
That elf is going to be a friend to your family for many, many years.
When it comes to religion, the elves worship Corellin, the protector and preserver of life, also the creator of elves.
And the mortal enemy of the orc god, Grumish.
Yes.
Grumish is missing an eye thanks to Krellin, which is a blatant ripoff of Sauron. Grumish's symbol is a giant flaming eye, pretty much. Gnomes, I've never really played gnomes, and it's been a long time since I've read
gnomes.
So really all I can say on gnomes are they're tricksters at heart, and they're masters of illusion magic, and those two things go hand in hand so well, and their god is amazing. Their god is the troll of other gods. There's the god of rogues, who we'll get into on our week on deities, who has been known to play the occasional trick on other gods by stealing shit and hiding them. The gnome god is just hilarious. I'm pretty sure there's actually a stated thing where the reason gnomes have a mortal enemy in gnolls is that the gnome god once trapped the gnoll god in a cavern using dynamite because he thought it'd be funny. And ever since then, the gnoll god has sworn vengeance on the gnome god, and just this massive race tension war has spawned as a result.
Gnomes get a +2 to Constitution, -2 to Strength. They're small and tough, like dwarves, because I believe gnomes are kind of racial brothers with dwarves. But they're not as strong as dwarves, so they lose Strength. They are small. This is the first small class. They get a +1 size bonus to armor class, because they're harder to hit. +1 size bonus to attack rolls, because their hits are smaller, so there's more area to affect. And a +4 size bonus on hide checks, because they're small. A gnome uses smaller weapons, which means they do less damage. And their lifting and carrying limits are 3/4 of a medium character, so they can't carry as much. Because they're small, they have a land speed of 20, like a dwarf, but without the dwarf's bonus. Gnomes get low light vision like elves because they kind of work above ground and below ground. Gnomes gain weapon familiarity. They can treat a gnome hooked hammer as a martial weapon rather than an exotic weapon. They get a +2 racial bonus on saving throws against illusions because gnomes are illusions, essentially. They know illusions, they cast illusions, they're really good against them. You can add +1 to the DC for all saving throws against a gnome's illusions. So making a gnome illusionist or wizard who specializes in illusion is actually pretty decent. Gnomes gain a +1 racial bonus against kobolds and goblinoids because they're pretty much their mortal enemies. And like dwarves, gnomes gain a +4 dodge bonus against giants, which is kind of terrifying because that also counts into the fact that gnomes are small. And giants are already losing a bit of attack because they're large. Now, the giant's not going to hit a gnome that much.
As an aside, I just remembered it was actually the kobold god that the gnome god trapped.
Gnomes get a +2 racial bonus on listen checks. Actually, that's hilarious. Everything else has like 5 words of explanation. It just says here, gnomes have good ears. They get a +2 racial bonus on alchemy checks, on crafting alchemy, because their sensitive nose allows them to monitor alchemical processes. And gnomes gain automatic language, common and gnome. They gain bonus languages Draconic, Dwarven, Elven, Giant, Goblin, and Orc. They don't get any real specialized languages, but they get a pretty decent spread of the base languages.
Except they can also learn the languages of burrowing animals.
Yes, gnomes can talk to badgers, foxes, rabbits, and anything that really burrows. Just because they're gnomes, they automatically get speak with animals for that. This next ability is unique to gnomes. No other classes in the base handbook get this. Gnomes automatically know spells. So gnomes automatically once per day can cast Speak with Animals for burrowing mammals. But if your gnome has a charisma of at least 10, which, unless you got really shitty dice rolls, you do, a gnome can automatically cast once per day Dancing Lights, Ghost Town, or Prestidigitation, which is very nice as just like base spells. That's a nice thing to know without specializing in wizard. Depending on how creative you're pretty much going to have a use for Ghost Sound, Prestidigitation, and Dancing Lights.
Now, there is an issue with that. Gnome's use of his own spell-like abilities is charisma-based, and a wizard is intelligence-based. But their favorite class balances that.
The gnome favorite class is a bard.
Which is pretty much nothing but pure illusion magic.
Mm-hmm. Gnomes have an alignment. Whatever it is, that depends on the gnome. Gnome can be good, gnome can be bad. They can be lawful, they can be chaotic. And the gnomes don't give a fuck who their alignment is. You're a chaotic evil gnome, gnomes are happy with you. You're a lawful good gnome, all the gnomes are happy with you.
It's worth noting that if there ever was a gnome Hitler would have been chill with anything as long as it was a gnome.
Gnome's religion is Garl Glittergold, the watchful protector. He teaches that all gnomes are to cherish and support their communities, a bit like dwarves. But, unlike dwarves, he embraces pranks. Pranks are seen as ways to lighten the spirits and to keep gnomes humble. Not malicious things, it's just things that keep everyone down to earth and humble. So, every gnome, it is within their gnomish duty to prank their teammates.
Yep.
By power of gnome, you will know what it is to be pranked.
Gnomes get along with dwarves. They get along with most elves, most humans, most half-elves, and most half-orcs. They're a little suspicious of the taller ones, but it's a gnome. They really don't care. The only thing they don't like is goblins and giants and kobolds. But most people don't like those three.
I would like to note there are 3 classes that can be even more bullshit than a bard on a gnome. Sorcerer, because he's inherently charisma-based. Rogues, if you built a party face rogue, will have a bonus to his spell-like abilities because you will have built charisma. And gnome clerics. Gnome clerics are not something that you think of very often. In fact, you almost never think of clerics when you think of gnomes. But so help you, if you are blessed with the foresight to understand how bullshit a gnome cleric can become, when you've pumped all of your charisma into that cleric to maximize cleric abilities, you have created the illusion cleric.
You want a reason for a gnome to go adventuring? Fuck, you can create whatever you want. Gnomes will go on the widest amount of impulse just to go adventuring.
The most common explanation, I believe, in lore of any setting of D&D ever for gnome adventurers is simply the gnome got bored and just left the house one day and never came back. They just get bored and they just get up in the middle of work and just tell the boss, I'm gonna go adventure, boss. Okay? Okay, boss? Okay, you can do it. Okay, boss.
My favorite part of gnomes, everyone has their little established thing for names. Dwarves, the name isn't their own. Elves, you don't learn your name until 100. Gnomes have, on average, about 20 names. They choose whatever they want. They have a nickname for every single organization they're in. They have a name for their family. They have a name for their friends. And when they're in public society, what does a gnome do because people can't understand that many names? The gnome chooses whichever one is the most fun to say. So you get gnome names like Gobbledygoo, or Boobdipped, or Fawnkin, or Zook. Because gnomes don't give a fuck about anything, and the gnome life is just essentially having fun. In fact, the only time gnomes are unhappy is if there's a gnome funeral. And that is a very sad thing to see, and I'll just direct you to Races of Stone to read about that.
Half-elves, put simply, is what happens where you get a human, an elf, bow-chicka-meow-meow, and you get a half-elf.
And none of the bullshit.
None of the bullshit of either.
Half-elves, they're medium, base land speed is 30. They're immune to sleep spells like a normal elf, and they get the same +2 racial bonus. They also get low light vision like an elf. They don't get the elf proficiency with weapons, so they don't get the major bullshit thing. They get +1 racial bonus on listen, search, and spot, but they do not get the elf's ability to notice secret doors. They get +2 bonus on diplomacy and gather information checks, which is very nice. You kind of wonder why they don't get a +2 bonus to charisma, but apparently D&D had a big problem against giving anyone a +2 something for charisma.
It makes sense when we get to the fluff, and I'll cover that in a minute.
Well, that is a running thing that no one gets anything to charisma. Elves get elven blood, so for all negative and positive effects, half-elves are considered elves. So that's usually positive effects. Next race we'll get into, it's usually negative. They automatically know Common and Elven. They get bonus languages any, like a human. And their favorite class is any, like a human.
And getting into the fluff of them now a bit, the +2 diplomacy and gather information makes sense in the sense that half-elves are straddling 2 worlds. The long-lived mystique of the elves and the fast-paced, versatile living of the humans. To an elf, a human is a confusing thing. Humans change governments almost every generation. And to an elf, that means they're going to see an entire human civilization rise, go through multiple changes at the fundamental level, and then fall in the course of its lifetime. And he looks at that and wonders, the fuck are you doing? A half-elf is stuck between those 2 worlds. Because to a human, an elf is just, why don't you do anything? You're just sitting there. What are you doing? You spent like half the day sitting listening to one bird. The fuck are you doing? To an elf, that's barely a moment in time. To a human, that's half a day. Half a day is serious shit to spend doing one thing. That's a lot of time being wasted. And a half-elf is stuck somewhere in the middle. It's because of living this double life, they've had to learn to bridge the gap between their 2 halves. And that's why they have the bonus of diplomacy. Because they're natural mediators, because they are very much living in the middle of 2 very disparate people.
The only problem with that, though, is both sides view the other with
polar
some
opposite.
suspicion when it comes to half-elves. Because humans think half-elves as a mediator are favoring the elves, whereas elves
think
with
they're
half-elf
favoring
mediator
humans.
think they're favoring humans, and it always causes a bit of contention, which can be a right pain in the ass.
On the other hand, if you're charismatic enough as a half-elf to explain that away, just be like, bitch, no, I'm mediating, then good on you. You have good fluff there. And really, there's not much to say about half-elves other than they are very much half human, half elf, including in fluff. They're taller than elves because of being part human. They're also able to grow facial and body hair, which is something elves don't have. Their hair is generally longer than a human's hair. They can have darker hair, which elves don't have. And their names can depend on where they were raised, really. If they were raised as a human mostly, then they'll have a human name, which can be anything. If they were raised by elves mostly, they'll probably have elven names. Half-elves also generally don't have much of a home. They're usually outcasts. Even if their parents are prominent members of one society or another, or both societies, they're generally somewhere on the outside of both. And more often than not, half-elves usually end up kind of on the streets, or just somewhere where they're not really in a comfortable position. They're just outcasts from society, which is kind of where the gather information comes in. Because they're being on the outside means they have the luxury of being able to listen and not really be noticed, which over the course of a half-elf's life usually translates into that +2, because they've learned over their life how to take in what's around them and learn things that other people don't notice because they're right in the middle of it all. He has that ability to look from the outside and pluck out the information that everyone else in the room is missing.
In terms of their alignment, they tend to be chaotic due to their elven heritage, but they tend to lean towards both good and evil in equal proportions, like humans, so it's a very interesting mix. In terms of religion, if they've been raised among the elves, they'll follow the elven deity. If they've been raised among humans, they'll often follow Alohan, the goddess of woodlands.
Yeah, they usually keep a tie to the woods. That's just inherent in their elf blood, even if they weren't raised elven. A good rule of thumb with half-elves, even just completely ignoring the book, is generally think of what your main parent was. Was your main parent the human or the elf? And tend to think more in the realms of the race that you were raised by, as far as how you will have been raised and act. But always bear in mind in the back of your head that even if you were raised elf, you're still an outsider to other elves, which means you never quite fit in with other elves. Something about you made you stick out to other elves. And that's a good way to build your half-elf's fluff. If you're raised by elves, purposely give yourself body hair or facial hair, because that'll set you apart from your elf peers, because other elves won't have that. If you were raised by humans, be particularly elf-like in a way that is different than how you were raised, because that will make you stick out among the humans, is that you have a very elven way about you.
But never get your outcastness confused with having the worst lot in life, because you aren't the worst race in life that gets shit on. That is left to the half-orcs.
Oh, yes, the half-orc.
Poor half-orcs.
Where the half-elf has the benefit of they could be a child of privilege. I've had half-elves that I've played who were the son of a prominent human general and an elven diplomat. And there's half-orcs. There's rarely a pretty way to become a half-orc. It usually involves rape. There have been rare cases of love between a human and an orc. Not gonna lie, your human parent was probably evil as hell, because while the opposite can happen, that you had a neutral or good orc parent, that's usually a very un-orc-like orc. That un-orc-like orc was probably killed just for being an orc anyway. So, more often than not, it's either you were kidnapped by orcs as a slave and probably used as breeding stock, because I believe orcs view half-orcs essentially as cannon fodder. Because orcs in D&D, to kind of go off on orcs a bit so you can understand half-orcs a bit, orcs are not stupid. Orcs are actually smart. Goblins are the stupid ones. Orcs are smart, but they live in pretty much a perpetual state of tribal war. While some orc tribes can be united by bigger, stronger orcs and create orc kingdoms, even orc empires, but it's usually very similar to, say, the Mongolians or the Huns. That's the shape that a kingdom or an empire of orcs would take, is a horde of tribes that would fall apart the instant the unifying force of a strong leader is taken away. The half-orcs, you're looked at as stupid, you're looked at as weak, and if there's half-orcs in a community of orcs, they're usually on the front line with the full intention of you're probably going to die, but your death means that true orcs are going to live, and those true orcs will cut down the enemy.
The only use half-orcs have are as the diplomats of orc tribes. And that's very rarely will orcs resort to diplomacy.
Half-orcs are also the shortest lived of the core races, too.
Yep, because they're orcs.
Because they're part orc. Orcs are very short-lived. They breed like crazy, but they die within a handful of decades. I believe they become old somewhere in their 50s.
They are old at the age of 45, vulnerable at the age of 60, and they can live to a maximum of 80.
So when you think of an orc, think of back in the days when man didn't really live past 60 much, and you kind of have the idea of the lifespan of a half-orc, or orcs in general. There are a handful of good things from being a half-orc. You're incredibly strong.
Half-orcs gain +2 strength, and they lose 2 intelligence and 2 charisma. These are the only race that actually takes a penalty from being their race. You would have higher stats had you not become a half-orc. Orcs are medium, have a base land speed of 30, and they have dark vision. Now let's get into the interesting things of orcs, like every other race. Most people have a vision and they get all their interesting stuff. Orcs get orc blood, and that's it. What is orc blood, you ask? Same thing as elves. Half-elves are considered elves for the use of magic. And since elves are magical people, there's a bunch of spells that are related to elves. Orcs are the enemies of elves, so guess what? There's a bunch of spells that are bad for orcs.
And
which means orc blood is pretty much always a negative unless it's some kind of grummish rage spell.
And unfortunately, you may be thinking, well, doesn't it just mean that orcs have as many spells against elves? Orcs don't really spellcast. They have no time for spellcasters. They're very martial race. In fact, I believe they're very distrustful of magic.
Their favored race is barbarian.
Yep.
So it just gives you a hint of what they're generally going to be.
Yeah. Generally, as a half-orc, you're ugly. You almost always take physically after your orc parent. You're going to have protruding tusk-like teeth on your lower jaw. You probably have an underbite. You usually have sort of a pig-snouted face, big, pointed orc ears, gruff hair, general unkempt appearance, and you probably smell really, really bad because orcs do not smell well, and that's just a racial thing about orcs. Orc BO in general is just really bad.
In terms of their alignment, it's the same as half-elves.
Pretty much.
They tend towards chaos from their parents and, like, their human parents, good and evil equally.
The love for half-elves and half-orcs are almost entirely interchangeable. Just change elf with orc.
Yeah, pretty much same with religion. They'll worship either the orc gods or
the only big difference is that, like orcs, half-orcs seem to have like this inherent need to show off their battle scars as trophies. So any scar a half-orc might get, he usually goes out of his way to make sure it's on show. If he has a slash across his chest, when he's not wearing his armor, he's probably going to be showing off his chest constantly just so people can see this giant
That's
gash.
what leads into the big thing with half-orcs. Pretty much every half-orc's personality, for a good baseline, is you have something you need to prove. You need to either prove that you're tough enough that people won't judge you and attack you because you're an orc, or you need to prove that you're not orcish and people can trust you.
Right.
That's the thing. Half-orcs will constantly be trying to prove something. They're never in a state where they are okay. They're like, okay, life's good. They constantly need to prove that they're either tough enough, or they're not too tough, or they're nice, or they're not evil, or they're not raging or killing people.
I've wanted for some time to do a half-orc fighter, just so I can play with the fluff of a half-orc, but those penalties can be so detrimental that I would only do that if I was using dice roll and I had good dice rolls.
Half-orcs try to find acceptance from those who hate them, but no one really likes them. I mean, there's not a single race that really
Generally speaking, a half-orc may have friends who have, through traveling with him or knowing of his reputation, will see that he is a great guy to be around, or he's a dependable comrade to have in a fight. But the general population will always look down on a half-orc when he comes to the town. I think it should have been said in their fluff, and it's not, and it's a shame. Half-orcs just take refuge with gnomes, because more often than not, that's what I imagine most players do.
According to the official fluff, gnomes don't really care for half-orcs.
Yeah, but it's still gnomes. They don't really care as much as the people.
Not caring is not the same as a human's not caring. A human's not caring for an orc will have him running around saying, hey, Greenskin, get your fucking ass out of here, whenever he tries to go get some food somewhere. A gnome's not caring, will just be like, half-orc.
Keep him out of our parties. Don't put a whoopee cushion on his chair. He's a half-orc.
He'll rip your head off for it.
Don't make him humble. Fuck him.
But we'll still take his money. Halflings, contrary to what Lord of the Rings may have told you, in D&D, halflings are not very boring. They're essentially either gypsies or just generalized nomads. That's a good baseline of thinking, what is a halfling? He's a short D&D gypsy, or he's a short D&D nomad who travels with his family clan. And they either herd something seasonally, or they trade seasonally. You don't have one permanent settlement. You, at little, have two places you live, or you just never stick to one place and you just live in a traveling band who barters and trades for what they need as they travel. They have a racial deity of Yandala. They speak their own language, which uses common as the written script. They have family names and first names similar to humans. It's not like clan names with things like the gnomes and the dwarves and things like that, and it's not really family names in the same sense as an elf's family name. Halfling family names are just more in the same vein as a human's family name. It's just the last name of your family.
They also tend to try to get along with everyone. No matter what your race, they'll try to be your friend.
Yes,
even halves.
As a result, they're usually the best party face you can have if there's no one else present. The halfling's generally going to be a friendly kind of person anyway. Unless your halfling's a dick, in which case do not let the halfling do it. Of course, that's true with anybody. When you don't have a true party face, you just have to pick who's going to always represent the party. You generally pick the friendliest person. More often than not, that's the halfling. And they're also the only other small race, which brings us into racial traits.
Halflings get a +2 to Dex and -2 to Strength. They're quick, but not that strong. They're small, so they get the same bonuses as gnomes, and they lose the same base speed, so they're 20. They get a +2 racial bonus on Climb, Jump, and Move Silently, which you can start to see what their favorite class probably is. This is actually a big one right here. Halflings get a +1 racial bonus on all saving throws. Halflings are pretty good with luck. I believe halflings are actually a favorite class of luck-based prestige classes.
Yeah.
They get a +2 morale bonus on saving throws against fear. That stacks with their +1. So you try to fear a halfling, he's got an automatic +3 bonus. They get a +2 racial bonus on listen because they have keen ears. They get automatic languages common and halfling. Bonus languages dwarven, elven, gnome, goblin, and orc.
They also get a +1 racial bonus on attack rolls when it's a thrown weapon, like in sling.
We also forgot to bring this up back in half-orcs. Half-orcs, for some reason, get bonus language abyssal. Kind of weird, but halflings get favorite class rogue because they're little and quick. They're obviously going to go with rogue.
Their alignment is actually interesting. They tend towards neutral, but they can also be pretty much anything.
Yeah, what really happened with halflings in 3.5 is kind of funny. Early D&D editions was very inspired by the works of Tolkien. The halfling in 3.5 was sort of the last holdover of that Tolkien-inspired mold of D&D, where for whatever reason, while they changed everything else to be kind of different than what it had been in earlier generations where it was basically just Lord of the Rings, the game, they decided to keep halflings built in such a way that they are predisposed to all being Bilbo. They're all predisposed to being rogues that are very brave, even though they shouldn't be, who are neutral in attitude and alignment, and just find themselves in a world of adventure because of their happy-go-lucky nature. For whatever reason, that's kind of how the traits of the halfling came to be, is that in old editions of D&D, the halfling was literally designed to be the rogue, because Bilbo is essentially a rogue in The Hobbit.
At least it's not the Kender from another module, which we may get into another time.
Do not get halfling confused with Kender. You will not be a good party face if you get those two confused.
No.
And those are the races. We may have glossed over a few details. Certainly we could have gone into more detail on each individual race, but I did not want to spend multiple weeks on this thing like we did with classes. In fact, I think we'll be more in depth on them when we get near the end of our planned season. We have a plan to do one season of this as just the player's handbook, and we're going to move on from book to book, as I stated back in, I believe, week 2. When we get to the week on character creation, we'll definitely go more into the fluff of races when we explain the various characters that we'll be making and how they came to be. That's really where we'll get into the more specific fluffs of how it relates to creating your character. But that's just the general idea of what the races are. If you're looking to play a certain general feel, you should have a good idea of what race fits you based on what you heard here today. So without further ado, I believe that's it for the evening. On behalf of myself, Red Fox, and Fluxen, thank you all for listening. If you'd like to hear more from us on other things besides D&D, we all have streams. I have twitch.tv/SovekOnivris. Red Fox has twitch.tv/RedFox_NightFox, and Fluxen has twitch.tv/Fluxen. There's also a Patreon campaign where you can help support the podcast and my stream specifically at patreon.com/SovekOnivris, and every donation helps toward eventually getting more professional gear and being on more often as far as my stream goes, and hopefully maybe even getting more podcasts in and being more regular with other podcasts. So I hope you all enjoyed. Next week we'll have a new topic, not another thing of the same old for several weeks, so that's be fun. Let's hope we can keep that going. So once again, have a good evening, and I hope you all enjoyed.